In the Pokemon universe, this is God, right? It's a being that apparently created all things and all Pokemon, and can be any type in existence as long as its mythical tablets are held by it. Except, how did Arceus create everything when Groudon and Kyogre hadn't yet risen the land and filled the seas? Maybe Arceus created some Pokemon first to help him with the vast concept of creation. But what about Mew, who, to the best of the scientific consensus in the Pokemon world, is the genetic ancestor to all Pokemon? All of these questions deserve answers, but they all fundamentally fall under one broad category. How the heck does religion work in the world of Pokemon? First, some ground rules. For the purposes of this discussion, the mainline Pokemon games are what we're going to be talking about here. If something happened in the anime, in one of the films, or in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, feel free to point it out in the comments, but right now, I'm talking about the main series of games. Because Pokemon's continuity is far from continuous. In addition, this channel is all about over-analysing and over-academizing media. So expect to learn something about religion, or about Pokemon, or both. Let's go. For starters, it is worth really hammering home that Pokemon, as a concept even, owe an awful lot to Japanese folk religion. Shinto practices are a popular and enduring set of cultural behaviours which are common across the history of Japan, which very broadly refers to the belief that spirits of nature, anthropomorphized concepts, certain objects and animals, historic masters of their craft, and emperors are all part of a vast web of energy, and they manifest as specific beings to be venerated, who may provide good fortune, blessings, and purification as kami, or deities. These kami are often present in specific sacred spaces, and have authority over quite niche domains, such as rice, storms, fire, plague, a specific volcano, things like that. And let me be entirely clear, I believe these kami are direct analogues to legendary Pokemon. This is especially clear in the legendary trio of genies in Unova. Tornadus seems very much based on the kami of the wind, Thundurus on the kami of rain, and Landorus seems to take some inspiration from Inari, one of the most popular and enduring kami, who is responsible for rice, foxes, and, most relevant here, agriculture. As discussed, not all kami in Shinto are elemental forces or nature spirits. Taking as an example the great warriors, who are often represented as kami as well in this folk religious practice. People like Oda Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Totoyami Hideyoshi. We see legendary warrior Pokemon as well, reflected most clearly in the Swords of Justice, Virizion, Terrakion, Cabalion, and Keldeo, and that's just Gen 5. To give further credence to legendary Pokemon being just like these manifestations of energy, these deities, these kami, let's talk more about where kami are. From as early as the Yayoi period, Japan's Bronze to Iron Age transition, kami were established as existing and specifically enshrined in certain sacred spaces. They're enshrined in physical, often natural sacred spaces separated out from the places that people can normally go. Either the objects representative most of the kami are housed in specific structures built only to be entered by dedicated priests, or prohibitions or signifiers of sacred space, like the Shimazawa rope, which indicates a sort of sacred liminal line between the world of normal people and the world of the kami. Oftentimes, legendary Pokemon are not encountered as other Pokemon are, just by wandering around in the grass or in a cave. Most of the time, they have their own discrete spaces where they stand and maintain their presence. In those rare cases where we do find roaming legendaries, they're often kind of less powerful trios, and oftentimes those trios are creatures that bring certain effects with them. Entei, sparking volcanoes wherever it stands. Thunderous and Tornadus bringing weather with them. Most of the times, these legendaries are found in specific, discrete places where it's really difficult for people to go. I mean, the ancient Hisuian people, 1,000 years before Pokemon Legends Arceus even, which was still, it's set in the past of the Pokemon world. They built the Temple of Sinnoh quite out of the way, specifically to venerate Arceus. And in Johto, we also see the kimono girls, the dancing girls in Japanese. They're instrumental in defending, hiding, and protecting the sacred spaces in which Lugia and Ho-Oh live. They also decide who might actually be worthy of visiting these legendary Pokemon in their domains. The Kimono Girls, I would argue, very, very clearly represent a certain kind of priestess in Shinto practice. The temple priestesses are part of a very small number of people who are allowed into the central shrine of Kami, and they're responsible for ritual worship, especially with things like the Kagura, which are folk dances specifically designed to entertain the kami, like the dancing girls. Of course, there are legendary Pokemon who are not inspired by Japanese kami, but clearly are inspired by some other influence. Kyogre has shades of Leviathan. Jirachi and Deoxys, although technically they're mythical, not legendary Pokemon, are based on genies and aliens respectively. Mewtwo is an allegory of the risks of cloning, and the Reggies are about as close as you can get to a golem without calling it Golett. And golems are from Jewish folklore. My point is, not every legendary Pokemon is inspired by a Japanese kami, but the way in which the people of the Pokemon world interact with them seems to fit a Shinto model of faith the best. They are viewed with impressed awe and reverence generally, and their power is recognised specifically in a certain domain. For example, the Lake Trio of Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf represent knowledge, emotion, and willpower, respectively. When we're looking at a broad map of deities that are specifically attributed certain quite niche domains and who are worshipped in specifically secluded areas far away from people and are sometimes even safeguarded in those locations by a tribe of dancing priestesses, I think you can't get any closer than Shinto. But it strikes me that there are a few big problems in accepting this theory that legendary Pokemon are essentially analogous to deities, specifically Shinto-style deity kami spirits. What does that make all the non-legendary Pokemon? And what happens when an 11-year-old catches God? First, it's worth noting that normal, non-legendary Pokemon probably seem a little more analogous to yokai than kami. Yokai are not deities, but they're also spirits which are supposed to physically act upon the world in traditional Japanese folk practice. To put it as succinctly as possible, yokai are basically goblins or fae or restless spirits. They are supernatural beings who largely become known through folktales and superstition, and they are largely differentiated from kami by the fact that yokai are never enshrined or worshipped, generally. These categories are fuzzy, but it is true that yokai forms like kami are very varied. They can resemble animals, humans, inanimate objects, or could even be shapeless or formless. In other words, I'd say it's pretty clear that many Pokemon are based on yokai, and that the way that yokai can be treated in the real world can also reflect some of the ways that Pokemon are treated in the Pokemon world as well. I'd say that there's a fair crossover between Pokemon and Yokai. In fact, there's a pretty good list that someone made that details every link that a Pokemon might have to a Yokai. It's worth checking out. I mean, goodness me, the Pokedex is filled with all sorts of hyperboles that are very, very common when people describe the power sets of supernatural entities, such as Mikago being described as hotter than the sun, and therefore would liquefy any object placed within a few feet of him, including the Earth, which would not lead to a long-lived world, shall we say, if that were actually true. It is true that despite these absurd claims, Pokemon are still pretty dangerous. They can call down lightning, flood buildings, summon meteorites, and some of them have moves which can instantaneously lock any Pokemon unconscious. Unless it has Sturdy, I guess. From, I think, Gem 4 onwards. We best see some of this danger in Pokemon Legends Arceus. Pokemon in these games are big, nasty, and will fight you if you get in their way or encroach on their territory. Some are helpful, some are docile, but they're all pretty demonstrably dangerous. Unlike in Japan, though, the Pokemon's world's solution to this issue is not to develop a practice of exorcism and warding magic to keep these nasty, dangerous spirits at bay, or to go ahead and ask the legendary Pokemon for protection from all dangers that might befall them, like they would for Kami, for example. Instead, the impulse of the people of the Pokemon world is to capture these malignant entities and control them. I think we are best served to see trainers, especially those early trainers who are making Pokeballs out of apricorns, we're best to see them as some sorts of early exorcists or spirit tamers in this animistic world, a world in which anything can have an animating spirit, from a set of keys to a magnet to a bird. Early trainers are special people indeed, with the power to tame and capture these dangerous roaming wild entities, and hopefully tame them for good and keep them out of trouble for good. Religiously, in a world where everything could have an animating spirit, anything really, any object, anything can be a Pokemon, this has a lot of very, very complicated implications. If the people of a Pokemon world worship legendaries, which seems to be fairly clear-cut in most of the mainstream games, and these legendaries are also responsible for protecting the wilds and the Pokemon around them, as also seems to be the case, as legendary Pokemons are kind of the big protectors of their regions, and they seem to shepherd the Pokemon around them, how might a legendary Pokemon that protects a certain great forest react when its worshippers, those who hold it in high esteem, start kidnapping the Pokemon it's supposed to be protecting from said forest? So should these legendary Pokemon be in a constant state of strife, looking to attack anyone who comes along? That is kind of what happens in the games if you stumble into one of their lairs. They're always up for a fight. Maybe that's what's going on here. But there are a few other explanations as to why these legendary Pokemon don't go further in running amok in their local area, with the vast swaths of Pokemon being captured and stolen from their spaces over time. It could be that these divinities, or Kami, or legendary Pokemon, give some sort of respect or license or freedom to those who worship them, to allow them to hunt on their land, of course non-lethally. That goes without saying, it's a kid's game. Especially if these trainers treat Pokemon well, and they're judged as good-hearted and potentially good trainers for the Pokemon that this legendary beast is responsible for. I mean, we do occasionally see these legendary Pokemon joining the fight against evil teams, kind of aligning themselves with the good Pokemon-loving protagonist. It could be that they have a soft spot for people who are good trainers, generally, or people who show them the proper respect and are therefore good trainers because they show respect to the Pokemon world. Alternatively, it could be that the legendaries just simply don't care about the plight of the non-legendaries, or at least don't care enough to keep them out of human hands. Which leads to another option. Perhaps humans in the Pokemon system are actually the proper stewards of Pokemon, allowed by the powers of the universe to own, protect, and utilize Pokemon for their own will. This would make humans the chosen people of the Pokemon world, chosen perhaps even by Arceus to catch, battle, and befriend Pokemon. But going back to Pokemon Legends Arceus, we see that the traditional worshippers of Sinnoh, Arceus, the Diamond and the Pearl clan choose not to use Pokeballs to catch or train their Pokemon, despite them having been invented. I mean, most of the actions of the modern Pokemon world, catching Pokemon to digitize them, or breed them, or use them as trained prize fighters, seem kind of at odds with the notion of human people as a steward, a protector of Pokemon, a friend to Pokemon, and the guardians, therefore, of these creatures, ordained by God on high. I mean, the traditional way of being a trainer, which was make friends with a Pokemon until one day it's able and willing to help you out of a bit of a sticky situation, seems very much at odds with the modern world of PC boxes, gym challenges, and selective breeding. So have modern humans strayed too far from the original aspects of Arceus's given stewardship? Did Arceus even give us stewardship? Is this all part of some grand divine creator's plan? Well, to explore that, we need to actually address the elephant in the room, or maybe the weird deer thing. Pokemon has a supreme creator god. This is one of the things which really doesn't fit with the model that I've set out so far of a Shinto-esque religious system, because a singular supreme creator deity just isn't really a thing in Shinto. Yes, in 8th century Japanese texts we do see a set of deities, creative deities who are birthed from the primordial soup and the heavens, but not one overlord creator god, though. That's really not a Shinto thing. It's far more of a Christian thing, to be honest. I mean, it would also massively change how the people of a Pokemon world might see religion at all, really. Many of the people of this world, it seems, are convinced of Arceus' position as creator god. I mean, it's pretty well evidenced. Their myths say that Arceus created Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, who rule over time, space, and the other world, which kind of is a modern physical understanding of things. The first two is everything that exists, and the last one is everything that is supernatural. Given the things that we've seen Arceus do in the games, I'd say that these are fairly demonstrable to the people of the modern Pokemon world, that there's some extent to which Arceus is responsible for the creation of some of the most powerful and fundamental entities in the universe. Now we're going to take a look at what some of the in-game lore actually says, taken often from Pokédex entries across the generations of this game. About Arceus, the Pokédex has this to say. According to the legends of Sinnoh, this Pokemon emerged from an egg and shaped all life in this world. This is a close mirror of many real-world creation myths. Oftentimes, before anything else exists in the vast nothingness of nothing, some object or creature is present. Oftentimes, it's an egg. Sometimes it's a fully formed deity. And sometimes it's just an animal, writ large, formed to stir up some of the soup of creation. All of these stories and their permutations are really quite common across world mythology. And generally, these creator gods are the most significant ones in their pantheon. By the beliefs of those in Sinnoh, then, Arceus is a creative overgod responsible for all life. But by the myths of Hoenn, Groudon and Kyogre are responsible for the swelling of the seas, the rising of new land out of the sea itself, out of nothingness, really. The creation of new things. Does that not also engender the creation of new life? We're not sure. Groudon's Ruby Pokédex entry literally says it's raised lands of its own. And modern Pokemon science suggests that Mew's DNA is said to contain the genetic codes of all Pokemon, so it can use all kinds of techniques. And that many scientists believe Mew to be the ancestor of Pokemon. If Mew is the ancestor to Pokemon as a thing, was it the first thing created by Arceus? Or, if Arceus' DNA is contained within it as well, is Mew the ancestor to the creator deity? Did Arceus populate the landmasses of the world before Groudon raised them out of the ground? As discussed a bit earlier, I think this might all be explainable when we look at the differing standards of truth in a Pokemon world. I would argue that Pokemon researchers are not an authority on what is true in the world, given the Macago example from earlier. The first Pokédexes, as shown in Pokemon Legends Arceus, are field notes, created by catching and observing the activities of Pokemon. That's not the most rigorous method for understanding how exactly these creatures tick. It doesn't fit the standards of modern empirical research. The collection of folk beliefs, religious principles and scientific consensus, all sitting alongside each other in the Pokédexes of these various regions of the world, is, I believe, a window into what's really going on in the world of Pokemon. N's philosophy in Black and White is also really critical here. He desires to return to a world for Pokemon and Pokemon alone. He also wants to abolish the modern practice, which he finds distasteful, of catching Pokemon in Pokeballs. I mean, at the heart of all of Generation 5's philosophy is this battle between the old and the new. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in Oplucid City, which is either far in the future or set in its ways in the past, depending on which version of the game you're playing. I would argue that religion in the Pokemon world is in the midst of a massive upheaval in the face of new technologies. The quest to categorise and analyse every single creature in the world under the Pokédex system is a task now given out to junior researchers in the Pokemon labs. And the Pokédex itself is a mixture of these folk beliefs, these religious beliefs, rituals, superstitions, things someone's heard, and also observations about the scientific state of affairs in studying these creatures. Frankly, it's a mess of information. It speaks to a world that does not have a dominant voice for what is true. And add to that the fact that these ancient, rarely even seen before legendaries are not only making appearances in this modern Pokemon world, but are getting captured. They're being tamed, they're being controlled, they're being used as tools oftentimes by some of the game's villains. And also, the same thing's happening to them on behalf of the game's protagonist, the player. If these creatures, if these legendary Pokemon are Kami or Kami analogues, they would traditionally be unseen spirits, occasionally manifesting in sacred spaces in front of chosen representatives who have given their faith and their life's work to that specific Kami. think Yucine for Suicune. In the games, legendary Pokemon are very resistant to capture. They are the hardest creatures in the game, generally, to capture, alongside Metagross's evolutionary line for some reason. And they don't make it easy for you. They fight you if you try. Until the Master Ball was created. Until the Red Chain was created. Until the legendary hero of Unova needed to fight between truth and ideals again. Until the world comes to be threatened again, when creatures who have slept for eons in the form of a statue, so long they've been forgotten, have to reappear on the darkest day. My point is, in the modern world of Pokemon, these old ways of interacting with the yokai and kami-esque spirits of the world are gone, or at least incorporated very heavily into a modern technological world. Snowpoint Temple stands surrounded by a Pokemon gym and a commercial shipping dock. Pokemon become less wild and scary, and owning one becomes part of a teenager's preparation for leaving home and living on their own. And the old gods of the land either sit forgotten in a cave somewhere, or get exploited by cloning, DNA splicing, or get dragged into the world from ancient future or past paradoxical versions of existence. Just as our regular yokai-esque Pokemon have been commodified and demystified in the creation of the Pokedex, the accumulation of information, and the commodification of their existences. They're made less supernatural. Pokemon have jobs in healthcare, in construction, in mining. These are all shown in the games. I would argue that the gods of this Pokemon world are being demystified and desacralized in a similar fashion. Heatran's volcanic island is encroached upon by a battle zone in Sinnoh. Zapdos has just started hanging around power plants. And the professors in Scarlet and Violet build a lab deep in the forbidden ancient wild lands of Area Zero. In similar ways, science has been encroaching on legendary mystique, as I've already demonstrated. In essence, I believe that the ancient people of the Pokemon world did treat these beings as legendary creatures with supernatural abilities. The legendary ones have godly powers. They can flood the world, for goodness sake. But a slow, gradual realization that people have power over Pokemon. That man may capture God, dominate God, and use God in a battle against his mate, means that Pokemon faith as a whole is in a really tricky transitional state. Yes, in Alola, the Island Guardians, the kami-like Tapus, they're objects of respect, worship, great authority, and care, and love. They're part of the traditional folk religious practice of the entire set of islands. But in regions that are more developed, this is far less the case. God is dead, and Team Galactic killed him. And just like in modern Japan, these old school religious practices, these religious institutions, these folk beliefs and actions still persist. But Shinto is no longer the dominant cultural force that it once was. Kami, like Inari-sama, one of the most significant kami, goddess of rice, fertility, foxes, and indeed agriculture, is not as relevant to a Japan that imports the majority of its food, around 60%. Yes, her shrines are visited by locals and tourists alike, and the motions are still gone through. Donations are given. Ritual purifications do still happen. But the harvest is no longer the core concern of most Japanese people's year. The same is true of Thunderous, Kami of the Rain, now reduced to a nuisance, who makes it rain on a different route every so often, and makes it so that a few grumpy people in a house are going to complain for a little bit when it does rain on them. Faith in the world of Pokemon is not dead and gone, but every year I feel the amount of people who put their faith in Pokemon declines. Because the more you find out about the mythical, mystical beasts of the world, the less magical they get. I hope you've enjoyed my musings on religion in the Pokemon world. I've wanted to talk about this subject for years. I mean, I tried to put together an essay back when I was studying at university on this very subject. I really hope you've enjoyed yourself, learned something, or had some thoughts of your own about how this all could fit together. Maybe I've inspired some world-building thoughts or something else. But if I have inspired something, please do the YouTube things, like, subscribe if you want to hear more of my ramblings and musings on all sorts of things: fantasy, faith, religion, world building, and everything in between. And if you really, really enjoy what I make here, why not check out my channel memberships, which I launched just the other week. It's a great place to get a better communication with me, to get early access to some of these videos whenever they're actually finished, and to get access to the VODs of live streams, which will be happening very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.